Recently, a friend of mine said to me, "What do you do to practice in dry fire? What drills do you do to improve your skill level?" And I said to her, I think that what you're really asking me is what drills could I do to improve my skill level? Now, if there is one thing that most people could do to improve their shooting, it would be to improve their trigger control. Trigger control really is the heart of shooting. And we can do a lot to improve our trigger control in dry fire. Now, when I am demonstrating these techniques, I am going to use a Glock 19. For one thing, the Glock 19 is the most popular handgun in America. Also, Glocks are great to demonstrate trigger control on because not only can you see the techniques, you can hear them. Now, as we are practicing in dry fire, obviously, we're going to do this with an unloaded gun, no round in the chamber, no magazine in the gun, no live ammo in the same room where we're dry firing. We're always going to keep the gun pointed at a safe backstop. Also, I want to mention before we get started that as you are practicing these techniques, up until we get to the point, where we're doing them really fast and we don't have time to reacquire our two-handed grip before we pull the trigger again, actually we're going to do a lot of our practice, hand cycling the action and then reacquiring our two-handed grip before we pull the trigger again. However, for the purposes of demonstration, so you can see my trigger finger, I'm going to demonstrate it with just one hand on the gun. So I'm not blocking your view of my trigger finger with the left hand. Okay, here is how we practice trigger control dry fire. Okay, before we go any further, I just want to mention that I'm about to start talking about a concept in shooting that is called the wall. When I was taught these techniques myself 25 years ago, my instructor called it the link. And that is what I called it myself as well for a long time. So even though I am aware that the wall is what most people call it today, I have absolutely no doubt that before we are done, I am going to call it the link at least once. You just watch. Okay, we are going to talk about how to prep the trigger and how to hit the trigger reset. But before we do that, I want to make it really clear that prepping the trigger and hitting the trigger reset is not the be-all, end-all of trigger control. There are other techniques that we need to know how to do. Having said that, trigger prep and hitting the reset are very useful techniques to know how to execute, and they will swiftly have a positive effect on your ability to shoot the gun accurately. Now, to start with, we are going to put our finger on the trigger and we are going to apply pressure to the trigger. As we do that, we will find that we have a fair amount of movement of the trigger where it doesn't really take that much pressure to move the trigger. And then at the end, it suddenly gets a lot harder. That movement where it doesn't take a lot of pressure to pull the trigger to the rear, we call slack, or some people call it uptake. And then the point where it suddenly gets harder, we call the wall. So we put our finger on the trigger and we take up the slack until we hit the wall. At that point, we just slowly, incrementally apply pressure until the trigger releases. And if there had been ammo in the gun, we would have fired the gun. Now, what we're going to do is we're just going to do that a few times. You know, feel where the wall is. Feel how much pressure it requires to pull the trigger all the way to the rear. Now, I happen to know, because I've measured it with my NRA weight set, that the trigger pulls on this gun go 4¼ pounds. This is actually lighter than, you know, an out-of-the-box Glock. That's because I went in and I polished all the relevant contact surfaces in the trigger mechanism. I'm still running all the factory springs, including the firing pin spring. I am using a Vickers Tactical Tango Down trigger. That doesn't make the trigger pulls lighter. I just like how it feels, and I like the fact that it shortens the trigger reach. It doesn't actually really matter how heavy the trigger is, or that you know how heavy the trigger is. What matters is that you know how much pressure it requires on the trigger to make the trigger release. That you have that in your mind, that you have that in your trigger finger. So you just do that until you have that memorized. Okay, then we're going to progress to take up the slack until you hit the wall, and then apply almost that much pressure, but not quite. Like if this was a 5-pound trigger pull, we would want to have 4½ pounds of pressure on the trigger. Basically, we are taking this, concealment-oriented Glock 19, and we are turning it into a super target pistol with a 1/2-pound trigger pull. Then we apply that last little bit of pressure to pull the trigger all the way to the rear. Then, since we don't have live ammo in the gun to cause the slide to cycle, and it's the action of the slide cycling that resets the trigger action, we're actually going to have to reset the trigger action by hand by cycling the slide. So, as we do that, we hold the trigger to the rear. Then, slowly, we let the trigger go forward until it resets. Right there. And not only can we feel it in our trigger finger, we can hear it. Then we just go back to doing what we've already done, only this time we don't have to deal with the take-up. Because on the Glock, the reset and the wall are in the same spot. As soon as the trigger resets, we can start pulling the trigger in the opposite direction and be ready to fire the gun again. So, after the trigger resets, we prep the trigger, last 1/2 pound of pressure, fire the gun. Cycle the action, hold the trigger to the rear, hit the reset, prep the trigger, fire the shot. Cycle the action, hold the trigger to the rear, hit the reset, prep the trigger, fire the shot. Now, once we've done that for a while, we are going to graduate to making the interval that we hold the trigger to the rear shorter. We're going to do everything else the same. We're just going to make the interval that we hold the trigger to the rear shorter. So it's going to look like this. Take up the slack till you hit the link, prep the trigger, fire the shot. Now, once we've done that, we're going to continue to make the interval that we hold the trigger to the rear even shorter, like so. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself there. Sorry about that. I'm so used to doing this fast, it's hard for me to make myself do it as a sequence of steps, so bear with me. We're going to go back a little bit here. Okay, so we cycle the action, and then we make the interval that we hold the trigger to the rear shorter. All right, now, once we've done that, we are going to graduate to hitting the reset and prepping the trigger while we're cycling the action. So that by the time, if we were firing the gun with live ammo, by the time the gun is down out of recoil, we would have the trigger reset and prepped and be half a pound away from firing the next shot. And it would look like this. So we're no longer holding the trigger to the rear. We're hitting the reset and prepping the trigger in recoil. Then, once we've done that, we are going to start applying that last half pound of pressure as the gun finishes cycling. So it's going to look like this. And that is how you practice prepping the trigger and hitting the reset in dry fire. If we are using a different sort of auto pistol, for instance, we're using a 1911, the same techniques apply. Put your finger on the trigger, take up the slack till you hit the wall, prep the trigger, fire the shot, hold it to the rear, cycle the action, let the trigger go forward until it resets, prep the trigger, fire the shot. If we're doing this with a double action auto, like the Beretta 92, we're not actually going to prep the trigger for the first shot. We're just going to pull through in one smooth movement. But at that point, we're right back to let the trigger go forward till it resets, prep the trigger, fire the shot. And that is how you practice prepping the trigger and hitting the reset in dry fire. Okay? Take up the slack till you hit the wall, prep the trigger, fire the shot. Hold the trigger to the rear. Cycle the action. Hit the wall, prep the trigger, fire the shot. And just keep doing that. Now, eventually, you're going to hit a point where you're manipulating the trigger so fast you don't have time to reacquire your two-handed grip in between shots. But you can manipulate the trigger faster. So it's basically going to look like this. Boom. I've got the trigger reset. Reacquire my grip. Just do it. And eventually, you're going to get to the point where you're just manipulating the trigger so fast you don't even have time to do that. So at that point, it's just going to be like... And that is how you get better at trigger control in dry fire.